Today I'm going to talk about the history and evolution of video games, and most of the time when we think about the history of video games, we think, a lot of people tend to think that Nintendo or Atari was first, and that was not the case, so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about where video games are going in the future. So in 1958, physicist Willy Higginbotham invented a table tennis game which was played on an oscilloscope. That measures voltage signals and kind of looks like an old submarine control panel from a 1960s movie. In 1961, Steve Russell at MIT invented the first interactive game called Space War that was played on a PDP-1 mainframe computer, which was a step up from your standard floor model punch card feeder computers. So that was pretty awesome for back then. So from 1966 to 1970, a guy named Ralph Baer, who was the inventor of the Simon game, kind of dominated that 3 years. He received money from the Army and invented a game that was could be viewed on TV, which Magnavox later licensed. His two games that were successful were a tennis game and a chasing game. So then we come to Atari. They invented the first arcade game, which was called Computer Space in 1971. They sold 1,500 games, but the public said it was too difficult to play. So in 1977, they came out with a home cartridge game, the Atari 2600, and it retailed for $199. In 1978, they came out with the football arcade game, which had the trackball controller, which was state-of-the-art for back then. In 1978, Space Invaders also came out, which was the first game to track and display high scores, which obviously, as everyone knows, had infamous success and set the stage for modern video games. It grossed $2 billion worldwide by 1982 and was put out by the Taito Corporation, who coincidentally makes the smartphone app Space Invaders to this day. So 1980 was a big year. Mattel debuted a real Atari competitor with a higher price point of $299. Battlezone, the first 3D game ever, came out, and that was later adapted for training for the military. 300,000 units of Pac-Man hit the streets from Namco, and Defender, the first game, incorporated a virtual world with a radar scope in the middle of the screen because the world was bigger than what your screen showed. In 1983, Nintendo introduced the NES in Japan, but it was known as Famicom. And Nintendo actually did not plan to enter the US market at all. They planned to license the NES to Atari and let them sell it, but Atari fell through with that. Big mistake for them. So from 85 to 86, NES was test marketed in New York City in 85. In 86, it was released officially to the rest of the US. It was an 8-bit game console. It retailed for $199 and was a big hit. So Sega came out with the Sega Master System, which was actually technically superior to the NES. And Atari re-released their 7800 to try to stay competitive, which was also their first backward compatible unit. Unfortunately for everyone else, Nintendo dominated the market because they released their unit first. So in '89, Nintendo came out with their first handheld called Game Boy, also known as the Four Shades of Grey. Sega debuted the Genesis, which was a 16-bit game console, which was their way of trying to pull away from Nintendo. And Atari put out the Lynx, a color handheld, but it was a lot more expensive than the Game Boy, and you needed to buy extra chips to make it work. In '91, the Super NES came out. It was a 16-bit home console, and it actually dominated into the 32-bit era with the releases of Donkey Kong and other games. In '93, Atari put out the Jaguar, and that claimed the first 32-bit spot, but it actually runs on two 16-bit consoles on the inside. In '94 through '95, the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 came out. They made their debut in Japan first and then US, and they were both 32-bit home consoles. And Nintendo introduced the 64 in Japan in that year. So then in '96, Nintendo brought out the 64 in the US, and that was a 64-bit unit, so they completely did not even manufacture a 32-bit unit. They went right from this one to the N64. And Atari started making internet stations. In '98, the Sega Dreamcast came out in Japan, which operated on a Windows system and allowed compatibility for PC games. In 2000, PlayStation 2 was released, but it was sold out by morning, so it was a very hot commodity and very hard for people to get it first. In '01, we saw the debut of the Xbox, which was a Microsoft unit. It had a built-in hard drive and Ethernet port, which was very attractive to a lot of people. Nintendo answered that with the GameCube and Game Boy Advance. And Sega actually exited the market permanently, becoming a third-party developer. So in '04, Nintendo brought out the DS that had 2 screens, one with touch capabilities. That was the first time we saw touch screen capabilities. In '05, we got the PSP from PlayStation, which was their handheld, and an Xbox 360. In '06, Nintendo came out with the Wii, which obviously gave everyone all new ways to play video games and very interactive. But the PS3 also came out, excuse me, which had a unified gaming service, multimedia capabilities, and connectivity to the PSP and Blu-ray. So from '07 to '12, we saw various games released for all 3 major units, the Wii, the PS3, and the Xbox 360. We've also seen PC games and virtual worlds such as Second Life, interactive classrooms, interactive business meetings, and then also mobile game apps and social media apps dominate the stage now. So in conclusion, I would say that the future is unknown and exciting. It's been 6 years since the last major console releases, so we're due for some more. And the development possibilities are endless with technological advances.